agradecer al comité organizador, especialmente al doctor Machado, por haberme asignado un tema tan interesante, con tanto, no se puede decir ya futuro, sino que ya hay que decir presente, porque digo, hay muchos hospitales en el mundo que ya están utilizando esto. Vamos a escuchar una charla pregrabada del doctor Paul Friedman, a posteriori de los cuales tenemos algún tiempo para intercambiar algunos diapositivos con diapositivos míos con alguna reflexión al respecto. El doctor Paul Friedman es ampliamente conocido, pero resumiendo, tiene un currículum impresionante, imposible de relatar acá por razones prácticas. Es profesor de medicina y chair, o sea, jefe del departamento cardiovascular de la Clínica Mayo en Rochester, en Minnesota, unos hospitales, todo el mundo sabe, por supuesto, que son los hospitales más importantes del mundo. Él es board, está certificado en medicina cardiovascular y en electrofisiología, rama a la cual dedicó el mayor tiempo de su vida. Trabaja en todos los congresos norteamericanos, con enorme cantidad de publicaciones y de relatos orales. Antes el doctor Friedman sirvió como director del sistema está trabajando en electrofisiología de dispositivos implantables para tratamiento de arritmias. También es ingeniero eléctrico, es increíble esto, con una amplia experiencia en innovación. Tiene más de 40 patentes con relativa a dispositivos implantables para tratamiento de arritmias. Es investigador, tiene más de 250 publicaciones originales. También ha sido director, es corrientemente director de 5 meetings internacionales sobre cardiología, editor de 7 libros y autor de más de 60 capítulos de libros vinculados no solo a la rama de electrofisiología, sino que con un currículum mucho más amplio, también dedicado a lo que vamos a hablar hoy, que es la aplicación de la inteligencia artificial en cardiología. Así que vamos a escuchar su charla y después tenemos unos minutos al final para comentar algunos diapositivos míos y intercambiar entre nosotros. Así que bueno, vamos a la charla del doctor Friedman.
Hola, yo soy Paul Friedman y agradezco mucho la invitación para hablar con ustedes en la Sociedad Uruguaya de Cardiología. Y lo siento que no puedo estar ahí con ustedes. What I'll be speaking about today is the application of artificial intelligence to detect occult aortic stenosis as well as structural heart disease. And I'll start with a simple question. Who do you think painted this painting? Now, my talk isn't about art, but I just highlight this because, interestingly, if you would have said DALL-E, you'd be correct. But I'll note that it's DALL-E, the open AI, artificial intelligence, generative AI, when I asked it to create a painting in the style of Chagall, with a cardiologist taking care of a patient with atrial fibrillation, and you can see what it created, underscoring both the power of artificial intelligence as well as the concerns in that in some ways there is intellectual property that belongs to artists that were gleaned from the internet that this AI is using to create these fictitious, so to speak, paintings. These are my disclosures. And I thought I would start here. In 1672, a Parisian shoemaker dies suddenly, as recorded by Bonitus in his Sepulchritum in the section in 1679 of De Morte Repentina, or of sudden death. And what they found was that there were aortic valves of bone. This is something I'm going to come back to. But it gets to this primordial question that humanity has asked. What's going to happen to me? Can I predict it? Can I do something to prevent it? And the addressing of these questions is the fundamental topic of the application of artificial intelligence into cardiovascular medicine, whether we're talking about aortic valvular disease or other lesions. Because when you think about the practice of medicine and the natural history of disease, you have someone living his or her life and they feel great when suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, signs and symptoms develop. And only then do we typically begin doing diagnostic testing to try to find the mechanism. But there's a fundamental problem with this approach because the very first event, especially in cardiovascular medicine, may be a myocardial infarction, stroke, or sudden cardiac arrest. But we know that atherosclerotic lesion, the metabolic and physiologic derangements that gave rise to that event have been present typically for decades. And that if we could learn to identify the invisible signals that our bodies are giving off all the time, we could prevent those catastrophic, cataclysmic events before they happen. And that's the subject of this work in artificial intelligence. We started with asymptomatic left ventricular dysfunction because it impacted 2% of the global population, 7 million people just in the United States, 9% of people over the age of 60. And importantly, we all recognize there are multiple well-defined treatments that lower mortality, prevent hospitalization, including beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, SGLT2 inhibitors, implantable defibrillators, resynchronization devices. But before disease-altering and life-saving therapies can be instituted, we have to identify the disease. And even in resource-rich environments, identification requires expensive, not readily available tests. In the US, it may take 2 or 3 hours to get into a medical appointment, get an ultrasound of the heart, an echocardiogram. In a pandemic, it meant being face-to-face with a sonographer for half an hour. All of us recognize, however, that if we place a microelectrode into a single cardiomyocyte, we get this action potential, this voltage over time of the heart cell. The channels that control these voltages are so critical to life, they've minimally evolved from bacteria to humans. If you stop and think about it, every thought in your head right now, every move you make, and every breath you take is controlled by these electrical currents. And it turns out that for many disease states, these currents, these voltages are modified, and that change occurs before there are visible changes in an echocardiogram, a CT scan, or an MRI scan. And if we aggregate millions of these cardiomyocytes, of course, and record the voltage at a distance, at the skin surface, we get the electrocardiogram, which is ubiquitous, widely available, inexpensive, painless, and integrated into work streams. So in order to extract these signals from the ECG, we used our robust digital warehouse of data, and we created a convolutional neural network, a form of artificial intelligence designed to mimic human cortex. And essentially what we did was we fed in the digital voltage time waveform of the ECG for patients who also had a paired echocardiogram, and we asked the network what was the ejection fraction, what was the pump strength. And of course, the network had no idea. It had never seen an ECG before. So it would guess, it would say 35%. And during training, we would say, no, you're wrong. It's actually 55%. And these networks, which are comprised of multiple small nonlinear math equations, each designed to mimic a neuron when sufficient inputs lead to an output, would then adjust the weights and biases just ever so slightly to minimize an error function and get a more accurate answer. And that process was repeated thousands of times, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, until the network became very powerful and could, in fact, from an ECG identify pump strength. So then we fed it unknown ECGs to see whether it could determine whether or not a weak heart pump was present or not. And it turns out it was a very powerful test. Now, we measure the power of a test by the area under the receiver operating characteristic. And when you think about commonly used tests, a treadmill test is a 0.85, pap smear 0.7. A perfect test would be a 1. This test, the computer's ability to read an ECG was a 0.93, a very powerful test. Here's what's more striking. When we got what we thought was a false positive, that is, the AI ECG says there's a weak heart pump. The echocardiogram says, no, it's normal. We follow those patients for 6 years, and they have a 5-fold increased risk of developing a weak heart pump. It seems like magic, like it's predicting disease. But we recognize what's happening is that the disease is affecting those ion channels, leading to multiple nonlinear abnormalities, that if we as humans could see these multiple small, non-directional perhaps changes in different and potentially even unnamed segments of the ECG, then we too would see it. If you think about it, a myocardial infarction involves occlusion of one artery and millions of myocytes affected in a similar direction, causing a change in a known segment, the ST segment, for example. So this approach lets us identify high-risk individuals. Now, at this point, we had only fed in the time voltage waveform. And we thought, what if we tell the computer the age and sex of the person? Because we know that impacts heart disease. Would it help? And amazingly, it didn't. We thought, how is that possible? Then we thought maybe from reading the ECG, the computer already knows the age and sex of the person whose ECG it is. So we asked it. And take a look what we found. For sex, the area under the curve is 0.97, almost perfect. In other words, the computer reading someone's ECG is better able to determine their sex than I am walking down the street looking at them. A really powerful test. What was even more striking is this concept of age. On the x-axis, we have the chronologic age of a person in years, and on the y-axis, we have the AI-ECG age. Notice how, while there's a good correlation, there's a cloud. And it turns out when we started looking at charts, there's some people who are 40, but they look like they're 60. And it turns out that's somebody who's had multiple infarctions, diabetes, hypertension, obesity. Whereas somebody who's 60 and looks like they're 40 is somebody who's coming in for an annual evaluation. They watch what they eat, they exercise. And we've come to realize that the AI-ECG age is the physiologic age or biologic age. Let me give you an example. One of my favorite cases. This is a man who at age 38 looks like he's 55, and as time goes on, he's getting older rapidly until he hits 53. Then something dramatic happens. He starts getting younger. I thought, well, what could be going on here? And when I've asked live audiences, people have said, he stopped smoking. He started exercising. One man said he got a divorce. Another man said he got married. But what actually happened was he got a heart transplant. He literally got the heart of a 16-year-old, and he started losing weight, and his blood pressure normalized. His diabetes went away. And in fact, we've seen several interesting, and I'll just show one or two more examples. A 35-year-old woman who presented to our CV prevention clinic for weight loss. She weighed 106 kilograms when she presented. She was 48 years old by AI-ECG age, giving her an age gap of 6 years, meaning her physiologic AI-ECG age was 6 years older than her actual age. Remarkably, she lost weight. And when she did lose 10 kilograms, her AI-ECG age gap went down to 0, showing that obesity may in fact be associated with an elevated physiologic age. There are biological mechanisms that we have studied. And in this case, a colleague of mine, Barry Boylston, looked at heart failure, which promotes a senescent phenotype independent of chronologic age. And he demonstrated that there were changes as expected in specific protein activations leading to myocardial senescence, as well as telomerase activity impacting telomere length in the DNA. And that these changes were associated with changes in the AI-ECG, so that a deep learning-derived cardiovascular age shares a genetic basis with other cardiac phenotypes. And indeed, we've seen that advancing AI-ECG age is a biomarker for vascular age in multiple areas. It turns out social isolation makes you physiologically older. Acute illness older, its recovery younger. We talked about obesity. Population studies have been consistent with the AI-ECG age correlating with vascular aging across populations. Coronary microvascular disease is associated with advanced AI-ECG age. And most interestingly to me, progeria, lamin AC deficiency, has a huge age gap, 15 or more years, and tragically early demise. Let me do one or two more cases. This is a 35-year-old asymptomatic man who presented after his sister died suddenly, tragically, unexpectedly. His electrocardiogram, according to the standard computer, was normal. Take a look at it yourself. See what you think. We ran this through our AI algorithm, and it said, there's a weak heart pump present. High probability of ventricular dysfunction. Echocardiogram showed an ejection fraction of 18%, and it turns out there was a familial dilated cardiomyopathy. And you think, my gosh, what if she had had this test before her tragic event? Here's another case. AI-ECG is positive for a low EF. Echocardiogram normal, false positive. 5 years later, age 33, ejection fraction is now 31%. And it just gets to this point that these changes are so sensitive, they predict disease before we see it in our standard tests. And it raises this concept of an AI disease previvor. What if you know you're going to get a disease? Can we prevent it? What does it do to your psyche? What does it do to your insurance? They're important personal, medical, and societal questions. Now, because it's software-based, we move very quickly from initial description to FDA breakthrough technology designation to emergency use authorization. But a key question remains, can it impact clinical practice? Because what we'd like to see is you do an electrocardiogram, AI is run, there's an EHR notification, and then we would get an echocardiogram that would lead to evidence-based therapies to reduce death and prevent symptoms, drugs and devices to prevent bad things happening to people. But there's a missing piece here, and that piece is us. Do we believe it? Are there financial structures to allow the imaging? Do patients have access to the imaging? To address these questions, we performed a prospective clinical trial, the EAGLE study, in which we rapidly deployed it because it's software-based in primary care clinics in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And during 8 months, during the pandemic, we enrolled over 22,000 patients. And importantly, none of the care providers were cardiologists, none were AI specialists. These were primary care internists, family practitioners, advanced nurse practitioners, where the teams were assigned to 2 groups. In one group, whenever a clinician ordered an electrocardiogram because it was clinically indicated, they got an AI result. Ventricular dysfunction is present or not present. In the other group, whenever they ordered it, it was run in the background. And here's what we found. The AI was effective. The information, when provided on a routine ECG, increased the new diagnosis of a low EF by almost a third. The test performed just as well in the real world as it did in the retrospective analysis. What was also striking was the number of echoes, the imaging studies, the expensive resource was ordered the same in both groups. But in the group that had the AI information, they were better able to select high-risk individuals, so the yield of the imaging studies was higher. In other words, it appears that AI helps us better use our limited healthcare resources. Also intriguing was this concept of top-of-license care, because clinicians who most frequently followed the AI algorithms, which was more commonly nurse practitioners or PAs, were twice as likely to newly diagnose a low EF. Although in fairness, the internists had more complex patient panels. Once we demonstrated this, we thought, well, what if we could do this even more widely available, reach more patients? What if we could do it using a wearable watch? Because imagine that someone could be screened at home. For example, a patient being treated with chemotherapy, where they don't have to come in periodically for echocardiograms. Now, we used the Apple Watch only because Apple made their ECGs available via HealthKit. They had nothing to do with this study. And here you can see a 12-lead ECG, lead 1, from an actual 12-lead in a patient with a pacemaker with spikes. And here's the Apple Watch ECG. Apple filters their ECGs, and it looks wider without the spikes. So we had to teach the AI network how to read Apple Watch ECGs. It's as if you already know how to read in English or Spanish, but you only know how to read in block letters, and someone writes something in cursive. You learn it quickly, but you need to learn how to read that slightly different alphabet. So we did that, and here's what we found. We created an app that would allow people who had downloaded the Mayo Clinic app to send all their watch data to us securely, so that anybody who wanted to would get an email notification, do you want to be in the study? And if they said yes, they could then download the app, which would transmit all their ECGs to us, and we could then look at them in a dashboard, which I'll tell you about. And what we found was that by taking this approach, using one part-time study coordinator, we recruited roughly 2,500 patients from 46 states and 11 countries and received over 125,000 ECGs. So in other words, this allowed massively scalable, very rapid acquisition of data for this research study, completely changing how research studies are done. We didn't have to wait for patients to be enrolled to then come to the clinic. And here's what we also found. The test for screening for low EF was very powerful. Not quite as powerful as a 12-lead, but the AUC was 0.88. So that means that a consumer device has the possibility of saving lives by detecting a life-threatening disease. Additionally, one of the important questions is, what about healthcare equity? Because the watch is expensive, and are we going to limit healthcare to people who can afford it? But one hope would be that a watch is much less expensive than an ECG machine or an echo machine, and you could put one watch in a clinic, screen patients, and identify who then warrants additional evaluation. Last point I'll make on this is that we enrolled patients ages 18 through 94, and there was continued high engagement, especially in older patients. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of detail, but we have also identified the ability to detect diastolic dysfunction in patients with EIECG. And interestingly, it works as well, or in some cases better than echocardiography, because for patients with an indeterminate echocardiogram, the EIECG still predicts long-term mortality. And I thought I'd come back to a case. This is a 67-year-old man who lives within a few miles of Mayo Clinic in our own hometown, who presents with acute heart failure and dyspnea. You can see his ECG and chest x-ray here. And it turns out he had critical aortic stenosis. Now, it turns out under the mentorship of JO, Michal Shelley-Cohen, when she was visiting with us, developed an AI algorithm for screening for aortic stenosis. Now, here's that patient's ECG 8 years ago. Looks relatively unimpressive. AI ECG says no aortic stenosis. 3 years ago, before there were any symptoms or known aortic valve disease, the AI ECG is now positive. And this has been a common finding. And when he finally presents now with severe heart failure and aortic stenosis, it's very positive. But this finding that 2 to 3 years before diseases manifest, the AI ECG is identifying its occult presence, has been found across multiple diseases: amyloid heart disease, aortic stenosis, ventricular dysfunction. And there's now a rich pipeline of AI tools for structural and non-structural heart disease, several of which, by the way, there are important new drug therapies available. An important question is, how will we introduce these into therapy? And I'll show this in my last 2 slides. We have created in our electronic medical record, a screenshot of which is shown here, a link to the IECG dashboard. And when we select it, and this is live, has been for 2 years, has been used over 500,000 times at Mayo Clinic. Whenever I select this, we see all these AI analysis. Each dot is a single ECG. We can also quickly review the ECGs. This patient had silent atrial fibrillation, for example. So in conclusion, the IECG is available now, and it identifies occult disease and predicts impending disease. It's massively scalable. Like any test, requires prospective testing and validation, and we're seeing these prospective tests emerge. It appears to improve resource utilization, helps practitioners deliver top-of-license care. It can be easily embedded into existing clinical workflows. It's dramatically transforming medicine, and we're deploying it this year in multiple centers and are always eager to collaborate. And I'm happy to discuss this further at any time. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
Bueno, muy bien, impresionante, me encantó el concepto de edad electrocardiográfica y cómo puede ir variando para un lado y para el otro. O sea, avanzar, o si uno va mejorando su factor de riesgo, puede disminuir nuestra edad electrocardiográfica. Bueno, entonces, quería mostrarles esto. Para empezar, lo que voy a dar yo son unos muy breves minutos. Discovery 1, algunos se deben acordar, y no me digan que no, algunos se deben acordar, otros son, la mayoría de gente más joven que nosotros y no, pero ¿qué era esta nave? Una película fantástica que se estrenó en 1968, que más de uno debe haber ido al estreno en el momento original. Yo creo que es recomendable. Yo, sí, por supuesto. Esa película se la pueden youtubear, bajar, es algo para ver de nuevo, tiene una vigencia increíble. Se llamó la película 2001, Odisea del Espacio, de un director que es Stanley Kubrick, inglés, que fue personalmente mi primer contacto con la charla que estoy dando hoy, unos pocos años después. Era un viaje a Júpiter, la película basada sobre un viaje a Júpiter de 5 tripulantes, 2 en estado natural y 3 hibernados. y a esos 5 astronautas los acompañaba una computadora que decía que tenía inteligencia artificial. Yo obviamente jamás había escuchado hablar de eso, ¿no? Que se llamaba HAL 9000. El tema que si ustedes ven la película es impresionante, por lo más estamos hablando de una película del año 68. La computadora manejaba absolutamente todo, incluso las acciones de los astronautas durante el viaje. El tema, y ahí está a veces un poco lo interesante de la película, se rompió la computadora. Entonces vieron una serie de dificultades, pero ella poseía inteligencia, y pueden bajar el sonido ese mejor, inteligencia artificial. La inteligencia artificial es una tecnología que tiene la capacidad de hacer que las computadoras y las máquinas aprendan a resolver problemas que requieran esfuerzo humano. O sea, esto está diseñado para facilitarnos, ¿no? Los avances en potencia informática posibilitan analizar grandes cantidades de datos rápidamente, con coherencia y precisión. Durante el transcurso de esta charla, las computadoras ya se han alimentado con millones de datos más de lo que cuando comenzamos la charla. O sea, es algo que está en información continua. O sea, como dijo el doctor Friedman, hospitales que ya van mandando a la inteligencia artificial todos los electrocardiogramas que están haciendo y cada vez más. Esto permite a los científicos del área de atención médica aplicar la inteligencia artificial a enormes y complejos conjuntos de datos para detectar patrones de la información de los pacientes y así mejorar la toma de decisiones, el diagnóstico y el tratamiento. La inteligencia artificial que se refiere a la inteligencia que tienen las máquinas está presente en casi todos los ámbitos de la vida moderna y ahora venimos a hablar de lo que se aplica en medicina o en cardiología específicamente. La inteligencia artificial se emplea para programar computadoras que procesen y respondan a los datos de forma rápida y consistente a fin de lograr mejores resultados de tratamiento. Esta tecnología se implementa, entre otras cosas, para detectar enfermedades cardíacas, tratar accidentes cerebrovasculares más rápido, mejorar las capacidades de la radiología diagnóstica. En la parte de imagen esto es realmente brutal y es el presente. El componente básico de un sistema de inteligencia artificial es una red neuronal, ya lo explicó el doctor Friedman, no me voy a detener en eso. Por ejemplo, para encontrar un sistema informático es necesario incorporarle cientos de miles de conjuntos de lecturas similares para que los analice y lo hace. El sistema entonces se centra en un problema específico y va adquiriendo experiencia como los electrocardiogramas. De esta forma mostró la enorme diferencia estadísticamente significativa que hay entre electrocardiogramas analizados por la computadora, ni nombra a los electros informados por los cardiólogos, ¿no? Compara lo de las computadoras con comunes, los que salen ya con el diagnóstico, cuando sale el trazado, compara con los analizados por computadora, por inteligencia artificial, y hay una enorme ventaja con respecto a eso. De esta forma, el sistema de inteligencia artificial puede leer una prueba simple, detectar una afección cardíaca y predecir posibles problemas futuros, como él ya nos mostró. Este es el esquema un esquema similar a este, él ya lo comentó. Y entonces estamos de la etapa de la investigación a la práctica clínica. Como dijimos al principio, esto es presente, no es futuro. Los científicos y los médicos especializados en medicina cardiovascular combinan la inteligencia artificial en la práctica clínica para mejorar la atención. Ya hay simposios exclusivamente de inteligencia artificial en cardiología. Y alguno de esos, seguramente alguno de nosotros vamos a empezar a ir. Y entonces, para terminar, no podía dejar de nombrar algo que ustedes, por supuesto, ya deben conocer y posiblemente usen. El chat GPT es una herramienta que no se puede creer. No se puede creer. Yo la probé específicamente para esta charla. Es un sistema de chat basado en el modelo de lenguaje por inteligencia artificial GPT-3, desarrollado por la empresa Open Artificial Intelligence de Estados Unidos. Es un modelo con más de 175 millones de parámetros, entrenado con grandes cantidades de texto para realizar tareas relacionadas con el lenguaje, desde la traducción hasta la generación de cualquier cosa que quieran escribir. Esto no es para medicina, ni para cardiología, ni siquiera para medicina. Ustedes pueden poner ahí, bueno, cómo hacer una torta, cómo construir una pared, y les va a decir absolutamente todo en décimas de segundo. El tema es que a veces esos contenidos no están editados, y les voy a mostrar un ejemplo práctico de lo que yo busqué para esta charla, y pueden ver, yo lo comparo un poco con Wikipedia, ¿no? Que Wikipedia se edita recién posteriormente. Si lo leen algo, buscan algo y lo leen muy inmediatamente, algo publicado puede no estar editado, puede no ser totalmente de verdad, pero creo que es una herramienta tremenda que va a mejorar, a ayudarnos mucho. Yo puse el otro día el título en inglés, así como lo mandó Friedman, ¿tá? Inteligencia artificial en determinar la severidad de la estenosis aórtica, que era el título de la charla. y en décima de segundo mi computadora recibió, bueno, solo agarré primeros párrafos porque era kilométrico, aunque si usted lo analiza, ¿no? Acá dice que la inteligencia artificial puede ser usada para ayudar a determinar la severidad de la estenosis aórtica, una condición en que la válvula aórtica del corazón cada vez se va estrechando y obstruye el flujo sanguíneo. Puede ser usado en imágenes médicas como ecocardiografía y analiza imágenes que nos dan datos cuantitativos y medidas cuantitativas del grado de estenosis. El algoritmo de inteligencia artificial también puede integrar múltiples parámetros clínicos, integra los datos de la demografía, o sea, las características clínicas basales del paciente, su historia clínica, para ayudarnos a predecir la severidad de la estenosis aórtica y guiar los tratamientos, las decisiones terapéuticas. Y seguía muchísimo más. Uno puede copiar, pegar, hacer un PowerPoint, todo. El asunto, dos aspectos, nada más ya para terminar. Es lo que me dijo el ChatGPT sobre la valoración de la estenosis aórtica vinculada a la inteligencia artificial. Es un poco general, ¿correcto? Es un poco general. No dice, bueno, usted tiene que hacer el eco, tiene que hacer la tomografía, primer paso, segundo paso. Sí. No hablaba de gradientes, no hablaba de sustituciones valvulares, percutáneas, no hablaba era todo como unos consejos generales. O sea que es una herramienta que va a ir mejorando paulatinamente y que pero es realmente impresionante, pero como toda herramienta, es una herramienta, tiene que ser bien usada, porque si uno la usa mal puede no tener. Pero para terminar el último diapositivo, fíjese qué interesante. Leyendo esto también me encuentro con un editorial del JAC, sale en el boletín del TCT, ese Congreso de Cardiología Intervencionista más grande del mundo. Decía que hay muchísimos autores que bajan contenido, como yo estoy escribiendo sobre X, angioplastia en el tronco de la columna izquierda, y pongo ahí y sale una cantidad de cosas, y eso que saco lo copio y lo pego en un artículo que voy a mandar a la revista Uruguaya de Cardiología. Muchos autores del mundo bajan cosas de ChatGPT, obviamente lo leen, lo adornan, lo que fueron, y después ponen al ChatGPT como coautor. O sea, y ChatGPT no es nadie, no es el doctor Machado, no soy yo, no es el profesor Lluveras, es nadie, es algo que está en el éter, lo bajo y lo copio y lo pego, o sea, con lo cual yo trabajo muchísimo menos, porque los contenidos son interminables. Yo puedo hacer un trabajo de cientos y cientos de hojas sin haber leído. Hay que saberlo buscar, saber copiar, pegar y lo mando, y entonces pongo, como está, reconociendo un poco que no trabajé tanto, pongo ChatGPT como coautor. Entonces el editorialista de Jack, y después tengo otro, pero puso uno solo, el jefe de editores de JAMA, dice ChatGPT et al, no tan rápido, lo dicen las revistas cardiológicas y de medicina como JAMA, de medicina general, más importante del mundo, pero digo, hay trabajos por ahí andan que tienen el ChatGPT como coautor. Así que, bueno, muchísimas gracias por este tema tan interesante. Ese mismo editorial terminaba así: si la inteligencia artificial reemplazará a los médicos, se dice no los va a reemplazar, no va a reemplazar a los doctores, pero los puede hacer mejores. Así que, bueno, disculpen lo tarde que es y muchas gracias por su atención.